Hi, everybody. This is Carol Sherwood. Welcome to Stephen Avery, The Devil is in the Details. On this episode, I want to go over a topic that has been discussed quite a bit, but I think that there's some significance to it that I think maybe doesn't get discussed enough. And I want to go over it because I think it is relevant. I want to talk to you about Teresa Halbach's day planner. And when I say the day planner, I'm going to hold this up. I'm talking about the sheet of paper that was printed from her computer, and it's like an Outlook calendar, a week at a glance, if you will, to show what appointments and other activities that she would have going on that week. Okay, so let's start with this. We know on the day planner that it shows on the report itself, it shows that this was printed on October 30th. This would be Sunday at 10:29 p.m. So basically, the end of Teresa's Sunday, she's printed this page off of her calendar, and knowing what we know about Teresa, that people have said that she's organized and that she was very routine oriented in a lot of the things that she did because she was a busy person, then I'm going to safely say, I guess, that we can assume that she probably printed one of these weekly calendar pages out every week, probably on Sundays to get ready for the week ahead. So, regardless, that's just my opinion, but it would appear that this was probably something regularly done by her. So, what you see on this, and I want you to just notice it, is what you see are some inputs that have obviously been typed from the computer on there while it was on the computer. And then you see handwriting. So she obviously prints it out and then she makes additional notes on it that either she didn't have time to print or it may have been that she found it out after she printed. So we don't know if all these things were written the night that she printed it or the next morning or during the day. But this is what I want to go over with you. We're going to look at this day planner purely as it relates to phone calls. And we're going to follow the phone calls on the day planner. So, people have disagreed with me about this, and I will explain why as we go along. So, let me grab the phone call registry here. So, on October 31st, Teresa's day starts on Monday. She gets up, she does whatever she does to get ready. There are a few notes that are made on here that look like they're probably something that she scheduled to do when she got finished with her day because they're in the time slots. For example, if you look right here, she says, get Sarah's stuff from mom. Biz paperwork. Mom B-Day gift. Call Denise, call Dan or Danny. It's kind of hard to tell which one that one is. And then you've got these other notes over here. There's Courtney's play. Okay, so some of these things that she has written on here are obviously things that she plans on doing after her day is done. The get Sarah's stuff from mom, business paperwork, mom birthday gift, and then call Denise and call Danny. Those are all, she's got them filled in. If you notice, she has them filled in time slots. So she's probably well organized enough that she knows when her day will be finished. Mondays, if you look, Mondays, and we already confirmed this, are her Sheboygan area auto trader appointments. And if she does hustle shots while she's over there. So she's got a pretty good block of time from 9 until almost 2 o'clock for Sheboygan. Now remember, she lives in Hilbert. To get to Sheboygan, it's like almost an hour. So she's got this set up to where she's got travel time, I'm sure, and then that way she's blocked out enough time to where she can go to Sheboygan, do whatever she has to do, and then come back and then do these other things. So the things that are obviously written on here were either written when she printed it out at night or the next morning before she got her day started. All right. Now, here's where part of the discussion comes in, where people differ in their opinions. The note on here from Steve Speckman, who we know is the Speckman call, about him thinking he had an appointment and he's got to reschedule it now because she didn't show up. And then there's one from Denise picking up her, or scheduling to pick up her son's senior portrait proofs from Teresa, getting that appointment scheduled. So those things, people have argued that Teresa had to make those notes while she was still at home because phone pings don't show that she could have been in the Sheboygan area when those phone calls were made. But we also know that phone pings aren't highly reliable, or they weren't then. They may be more now because there's more towers. But depending on how many towers in the area and depending on the distance between the towers, there's the possibility that phone pings can be misread somewhat. So I don't put my faith in phone pings when it comes down to putting my trust in eyewitness testimony. So here's what we're going to go over. In the morning of that morning, Teresa at 10:44, Denise Coakley calls Teresa and she gets her voicemail, leaves her a voicemail and says, "Hey, I'm calling you back. You told me my son's proofs were ready. I'm scheduling a time to pick them up." All right. Not very long after, that's 10:45-ish, right about 11:35, Teresa calls Denise back and they talk for a minute and a half, and it's in the phone records. I looked up all testimony I could find in anything of Denise Coakley. All right. There's an interview with Denise from policemen, and then 2017, when Kathleen Zellner came on the case, then Denise also has an affidavit of the information. So there is an actual interview of Denise, which I find this kind of interesting. When you look at the phone calls on October 31st, and there's only 5 or 6 or 7 of them, all of them until she, isn't heard from again in that afternoon. But when you look at those phone calls, I would think that those phone calls were the most important witness interviews that should take place immediately, because those are the last people known on the phone to have talked to Teresa. Okay. So Teresa disappears October 31st, 2005, and Denise Coakley's interview from the police is dated 2/1 of 07. Okay. Why is there nothing else that references a conversation with Denise Coakley long before this and right after Teresa goes missing? I don't know. That's a question that only law enforcement and the investigators can answer. But I couldn't find anything else that show they interviewed her. So here's an interview of Denise, and this is what she tells in the interview. She says that she spoke with Teresa after leaving her a message, and Teresa called her back. She spoke with Teresa, and very specifically, she said when Halbach answered the phone, Halbach stated that she was driving and needed to pull over to the side of the road so she could write the appointment time down so she didn't forget it. That is in the Denise Coakley interview that was requested by Fossbender. So Denise clearly says right there, Teresa says she's driving and she needs to pull over and write the appointment time down so she didn't forget it. Okay? On the day planner, we see on Tuesday, because Denise said they agreed to meet at Teresa's studio on Tuesday at noon. And there's it written on there. It says Denise ST noon. I don't think anybody debates that that stands for Denise Studio noon. Okay. And it matches with the police interview, and it also matches with the affidavit. And again in 2017, now mind you, that's 2007. So 10 years later, in her affidavit, she said at that point, she told me she was driving, but she would pull over to check her calendar before scheduling my appointment. Okay? She says, during our conversation, Teresa checked her calendar and we scheduled an appointment for the following day at her studio in Green Bay for me to pick up the pictures. All right? So, November 1, she's supposed to go pick up the pictures. The point that I'm trying to make is Denise Coakley has verified under oath twice in a 10-year time period that is legally binding that Teresa Halbach told her she was driving and she would have to pull over. So, if that is the case, then in my opinion, and it's just my opinion for what it's worth, then it makes sense to me that that written right there, Denise Studio Noon, was handwritten on this piece of paper that Teresa had with her wherever she was in that car. Now, if you want to say that Teresa could have been right down the street from her house at a gas station and she was stopped to pull over at a gas station and it pinged on a cell phone tower in that same area, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not saying that that happened. What I'm saying is Denise has no reason to lie about Teresa driving and making that comment. And then she reiterates it 10 years later in another interview. So, and she's willing to say that under oath. Let's go to the next phone call because this is important too. All right. So now a little bit later at 11:27, all right, this is before Teresa calls Denise back, but after Denise had called her and left a message, Dan Morrow calls Teresa. All right. Dan called because he had an appointment with Teresa and he needed to reschedule. We found that information out. If you look on this little calendar right here on Thursday, Dan Morrow's information is handwritten on Thursday. All right. So my point is, this is one of those unexpected things that when somebody calls her and she's like, oh, I need to jot that down. Let me see what I have available because here's my life for this week on this piece of paper. So she writes down Dan Morrow. Dan doesn't say where Teresa was. He just said he called Teresa. His phone call, when you look at the phone records, is at 11:27. Dan gets voicemail, but Teresa within 5 minutes calls him back. Teresa calls him back at 11:31, and then she calls Denise back at 11:35. Okay? So there's two. We don't know if she said anything to Dan about driving, but she wrote something on this. Okay. Now let's keep going. 12:45 pops up. All right. So we're a little bit later. Speckman. All right. So now we've got Steve Speckman. I did a video on Steve Speckman, and you can, and why I think his phone call is so important, and you can go back and listen to it. But all I'm trying to do with this is to show you why Steve Speckman's information is important because of the day planner. All right. So when Speckman calls Teresa at 12:45, he and Teresa talk for about 3 minutes. Okay. And during that call, she finds out he's in Sheboygan. She's got the phone number. She's got information written. This one's a little different. It's not in a time slot. It's like in the corner. So it's like a kind of like an off, one-off note, like I'm driving or whatever. But let's go to Steve Speckman's interview and Steve Speckman's affidavit. He also gave an affidavit to Kathleen Zellner. In his interview, which, by the way, is interesting because his interview, remember, this happened 10/31/05, she goes missing. His interview still wasn't until February 1st of 06. Y'all, we're talking November, December, January, 3 months. 3 months later, Stephen at this point has already been arrested, is in jail, and being charged with murder. All right. Steve Speckman is on 1031 phone calls, and he's just now getting interviewed February 1st of 06. Denise didn't even get interviewed for another year, which I think is weird. But, so, another one by Fossbender. All right, so Fossbender talked to Steve Speckman. Now, in this interview, it's interesting because Fossbender says Special Agent Fossbender had previously spoken to Speckman briefly on Friday, January 26th. So just the Friday before this interview. And Fossbender said what Speckman told him on February 1st was the same thing that he had told him on that Friday. That he called Teresa, that she was driving. He says she had already left the area or was leaving the area. He said he would determine whether or not it was going to be one or two vehicles by the following Monday. He knew that she worked the area on Monday. All right. So, because he did comment that it would be by the next Monday. In the affidavit that Speckman gave to Kathleen Zellner in 2017, once again, 10 years after all this. With Speckman, it's 11 years. And he recites the same information. He called Teresa. They talked for a few minutes. She was driving. She would have to look at her calendar. And he said it would be one or two vehicles, and he would let her know. Now, when you look at this, this looks like a note that was written on the fly. It looks like something that she jotted quickly. She's in her routine of her day's worth of work that she's doing, and that was a call that came in. So let's go to the day planner. You've got two people who say Teresa was in her car driving, Denise Coakley and Stephen Speckman. And both of those people, now Morrow, I don't know because we don't know what that conversation completely was. But those two have said in both police interviews and in affidavits, Teresa said she was driving. People who want to say she didn't leave her house until after those notes were made, because that's what they say. That's what they disagree with me on, because a cell phone tower pings. And they say she had not left her house. And that's how this little puppy was at her house. Because here's what you got to remember in the investigation, now that we're back at the house, and this is given to Mark Wiegert and Leslie Lemieux when they go out to the house on 11/3, and Scott Blettern, the roommate, says he found this by her computer. So he found it there, and of course he gives it to him. So in the video that I had about Steve Speckman, one of the questions I had is, how did Scott Blettern get Steve Speckman's phone number? Teresa didn't have an appointment for him. She didn't know anything about it. The only place that phone number exists is handwritten on this right here, or it would show up on her phone records. Now remember, they pulled down phone records. Supposedly, they said they got copies of Teresa's phone records by guessing the password. That's just whatever. Whatever. But they got the list of Teresa's and they started calling people. But I want you to wait just a second. Scott Blettern finds this by the computer, on the computer, near the computer. And Scott Blettern called Steve Speckman at 4:10. Scott Blettern was at the house by himself before Ryan Hilgus got there, before anybody else got there, and he called Steve Speckman. So I go back to, how did he get Speckman's number? If he got it off of this, saying it was laying on the computer, then what that says to me is one of two things. Coakley's lying and Steve Speckman's lying. And I have a question. Why lie? Why lie about something as simple as Teresa said she was driving and she needed to pull over and write it down? The police wrote it in their report. So obviously they took the information and didn't have a real question of it. And then they repeated it to Kathleen Zellner in 2017. Both Coakley and Speckman said Teresa was driving. And she said she'd have to check her calendar. And she wrote down the appointment so she wouldn't forget. And she wrote down Speckman's information so she could check back with him on the next Monday. But yet, cell tower pings trump all of that and make Coakley a liar and Speckman a liar because they said Teresa said she was driving. I don't think so. I don't think so. Because if phone pings are the god of where Teresa was, and if Teresa was at that house, then that could be true that Scott found this by the computer. And those notes were written on there already. And Teresa didn't leave her house until after that. And it also means that Speckman lied about Teresa saying, if you can do it in the next 30 minutes, because Teresa couldn't have done it within the next 30 minutes if she'd have been at her house, because it takes an hour to get to Sheboygan. So I don't know about all the cell ping mystery, but I do know this. I don't believe that Speckman or Coakley have anything to gain or lose by lying about Teresa saying she was driving. And what that does is that puts this in the car with Teresa. And if this was in the car with Teresa, and if Scott Bledern gave this to Mark Wiegert and Leslie Lemieux that evening when they came over at about 6 o'clock-ish to start doing their investigation on the 3rd, that means one of two things. Either Teresa got home with it, or somewhere between her appointments that day and her travels the rest of the day, she was intercepted and someone got possession of this and it wound up back at her house. I just don't believe that Speckman and Coakley are lying. I just don't. I believe this note to meet Denise at the shop at noon the next day, and that the information on Speckman and even Dan Morrow's information, I believe those were written by Teresa because this was in her possession while she was in her car because she had left for work that day. And she didn't have time to come back home and leave this on her computer after the call with Speckman and then go all the way back. I just don't think that she's that illogical. To then, why would she go home? Oops, accidentally leave this at home. And then go to Zipperer. And then go to Avery Salvage. Makes no sense. I believe Teresa had this with her. And I believe those notes were made live. If not, if you believe that those cell phone tower pings trump it all, then you have to believe that Coakley and Speckman were lying about her driving. That's it. I can't think of any other way to make that work. Can't think of any other way to make that work. So, just my opinion. The day planner versus the phone calls. Thank you for listening. Join me for another exciting episode.